Richard Bach's book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, came out in 1970. In 1970, I was 13 years old, so don't do the math, okay? And I've been reading about this book lately because this book was seminal to me. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And in 1970, what I discovered was the only reason it got published is because, he shopped it around to all kinds of publishers, and everybody thought it was just idiotic and didn't want to publish it. And Jonathan Livingston Seagull is the journey of a seagull into basically transformation and moving into higher planes of spiritual expression and realization, written completely mythologically. I mean, Mr. Bach was just unabashedly mythological about it, and just put that forward. So finally, it was published. I don't know who finally published it, but the only reason it got published was because there was one editor at the publishing house that was just driving everybody crazy about why don't we take a chance and how come we don't have any courage and backbone and why don't we put this out there, especially during those times, that time we call the 60s, which was basically, I think what we call the 60s is something like from 1965 to kind of like 1975. That was the 60s. In terms of all the turmoil and social change and protest and people wanting to break loose and look for transformations in all kinds of ways. So the publishing company said, okay, we're going to print 5,000 of these things, throw them out there, not even in hardback. We're just going to go paperback, and we'll give Mr. Bach, about half of $1 profit for the whole thing if they sell out. And so you can do the math on that. So anyway, this book went out. There was no promotion, no advertising, no anything. And basically, within 2 or 3 years, by just simply word of mouth, suddenly they had to print, first of all, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and over the years, it would be millions of this book that you can sit down and easily read in a little over an hour. Maybe for me it was 2 hours, but most people it was a little over an hour. And just this amazing story. And I remember getting my copy in probably about 1973. I was going to high school, and there was a fundraiser for the library. And so what the high school did was they brought in books of brand new paperbacks that were, very pop culture at the time. And they brought in posters and stuff so you could go into the library and buy these books and posters. And I picked up a copy of it. I'd seen it around. I knew a lot of girls who'd been reading it, and they carried it in their purses. It was one of those books people read, and then they carried it. It was in your purse. It was in your back pocket. It's kind of a status thing, too, I think, for those of us who wanted to be counterculture, especially in a small-town high school. We thought we wanted to be cool. And I carried it in my back pocket, but I pulled it out all the time and read it. And I really didn't understand it, but I kept reading it, and it touched me somewhere within myself. Because basically, what Richard Bach says about it is, it's a book to break the chains that keep us stuck wherever we are and opens us up to our personal expression of freedom. Richard Bach, he's still around, and if you ever read anything about him, there's 2 themes in all the books he's written: flight and freedom, flight and freedom, flight and freedom, metaphor and freedom. He used flight as metaphor and freedom. Freedom to express, freedom to become, freedom to transcend, freedom to move beyond, freedom to heal. It's huge with him. And so I think that in looking back, it spoke to me because, like a lot of young people and teenagers, I felt chained. I felt restless. I felt disconnected with my parents. When I got into high school, I began to experiment. I began to experiment with intoxication. I began to experiment with social interactions and getting to know girls and having girls get to know me and all that stuff. And my parents, who were, they thought the Vietnam War was just fine, and they were really upset at what was happening in the college campuses, and they didn't understand rock and roll, and I was on the other side of all of that. And so these people who I loved so dearly, I was suddenly estranged from them, and I was kind of at war with them. And so There's this Seagull out there, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, you know, and there's a line in the book. I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, but it haunts me. It says, you know, they talk about the flock doing their thing, and they say, out there, alone, he is flying. He is testing the limits. And that called to me, but I didn't really understand it. Years later, in my 30s, after I tested the limits of my life to the point of creating a lot of carnage, and I discovered religious science, the works of Ernest Holmes, and the works of all of our other New Thought metaphysical ancestors. Richard Bach is right there in terms of breaking the chains that bind us, which are identified as consciousness. And it was when I blew up my life pretty good that someone who means the world to me to this day, someone I eventually married named Judy, just knowing me as a friend, she said, Andy, I think that there's this place that you could go, and I think you would like it. Because I was at war with God, I was at war with religion, but I was looking for something spiritual. And she knew that. And when I came back, I met Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and I began to have conversations with him. And I began to understand him through all kinds of other people. In the Eastern traditions, there is a theme that runs through those. And it's like this: attachment versus letting go, release, non-attachment, and surrender. In the simplicity of the Tao, it says, take hold of this and let go of that. Take hold of this and let go of that. Wow. That's one of the most profound ideas in all of its simplicity, because when I think about the ideas in my own life and in people I've worked with and gotten to know, what is it that really causes us the greatest challenges is when we can't let go of this so that we can grab a hold of that. For 20 years in Solano County, I was a juvenile corrections counselor. And I worked in a program of young men. Throughout my career, I worked with young men from 13 to 25, basically. People who had been convicted of felonies, and had lots of time. When I say time, when you're in the criminal justice system and you're convicted of things, you ring up time. And they call it confinement time. I mean, I met 14-year-old boys who had 10 years confinement time, 15 years confinement time. It was ridiculous, you know. And so I worked in that world. And there was a gentleman, and I worked in a facility where I worked on 70 individual dorms, 70-person dorms, 70 men dorms. And there would be three or four of us on shift to manage that dorm, to work with that dorm. Wide open, people of all different races and backgrounds and gangs and all kinds of things, and all of the stuff that goes on in that world, the unhealthy stuff. And so we were in those dorms. And there was a gentleman who came to our program every single year and spent about a half a day with our population. He lived in Sacramento, and I got to know him. And he primarily appealed to our African-American young men. And he was African-American himself. And the reason this is important is because, as you'll see, it's a central part of the story I want to tell you. So he would come in, and he was always dressed in the Afrocentric clothing it has a spiritual overlay to it. You know, the loose shirts, the long sleeves. The pants would very often match. Beautiful, gorgeous designs of earthen colors and just bold prints. And sometimes he would wear the hat, the little hat that doesn't have the brim, and it kind of goes straight up. He didn't. Sometimes he didn't, but sometimes he did. And he would wear amulets, and he would wear beads and things like that. He was obviously highly educated, had an incredible vocabulary, incredible ideas, and he would come in, and he attracted mainly African-American young people, although he opened it up to everybody, but that's who he attracted. And they would kind of make fun of him at first and laugh at him because, you know, these were street kids and gang backgrounds, and some of them were, you know, projecting the bravado and, you know, the toughness. And this was a gentle, well-spoken man. But after 10 minutes, he had him. He'd be speaking the language of breaking the chains of racism and poverty and criminality and drug addiction and gang affiliations. And he always spoke in the most accepting, honoring, loving tones, showing nothing but respect. No matter what was reflected to him, he was just completely respectful. And within 10 minutes, he'd have them in the palm of his hand. It was amazing. And I always volunteered to sit in with that group because I loved listening to him and getting to know him. After he'd been with us he was there for his 5th year. He decided to have lunch there with us, you know, in our cafeteria. And so I sat with him and I asked him, I said, can you tell me about yourself? You know, tell me what you're all about. He said, as a young, you know, he said, I grew up in poverty. I grew up in what you would call the ghetto, you know, or whatever, and a broken home and lots of well-meaning people, but unhealthy and kind of generations of things around poverty and drug use and criminality and stuff, and people trying to do the best they could. And he ended up in the streets at a very young age and joined a gang and was involved in some criminal activity. And at a very young age started to get himself into, you know, juvenile hall and California Youth Authority. And eventually, as a young man, you know, 22 to 25, he was involved in a violent criminal endeavor, and he was convicted and he was sent to prison for a really long time. I mean, it was going to be the majority of his life. So he went to prison, and he, you know, a lot of us have our wake-up call, whatever that is. And for him, he said there was a wake-up call. He said, I started looking around at the people that I was hanging out with, and he said, I was really listening to their story, and I was listening to my own story, and I looked at how we postured, and I looked at the masks we put on to try and hide our feelings, and I looked at how we were trying so desperately to survive. He said, I left the violent streets to go into the violent penitentiary, and he saw the power of racism and the power of feeling lost and hopeless and shame-based. And so he said, I don't know why. He said, I went to the prison library and I started pulling out books about just whatever I thought would help me understand it. Like what, you know, it was basically like, what happened to me? I came into the world, and as a really little kid, I'm running around and, you know, whatever, and I'm looking at butterflies and grass and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden it seems like I went down some direction. And he started to read books, and he started reading psychology and sociology and criminology. And back in those days, it's not so true now, and I hope we can return to this. There was actually college classes offered in prison, and inmates could get degrees if, you know, and he was long-term, and so he got himself in school, and he actually obtained a bachelor's degree while he was in state prison. And he began to learn more and more and more, but he still felt an emptiness inside, and he started to go into the direction of spirituality and possibly religion. And I want to say something here, and I want to be very careful what I say, because I I do not want to disrespect any religion. I'm just speaking from what he shared with me. He said that he had been raised around Christianity, and that's kind of where he started his search. But he said, and this was him, he said, I struggled with Christianity because by this time I was aware of slavery. I was aware of intrinsic and systemic racism in America, and how somehow there was a religious overlay there. And he said, and so the slave owners were Christians and the slaves were Christians. And he said, I didn't understand that. And he said, I became very uncomfortable with that. Again, I want to say this with respect because this is his story. And so he started to look around, and he found, and for the best way I can put it, the way he described it to me generically, he said, I found an Afrocentric belief system that had come from Africa through the Caribbean, through the South, but he was very much interested in the African aspects of it. And he began to read and study. And he took some comparative religions classes, and he said that he was going through books and literature and whatever he could get his hands on, and he started seeing this dress, the prints, the clothing, and the colors. He said it spoke to him for something that was beyond his experience growing up in his neighborhood and in his streets. And at this point, he didn't really know if he'd ever leave prison because he had such a long sentence. And so he just he said, I would cut pictures out of magazines or ask someone to run copies of them if they were in books of this clothing, and some of the symbolism, and he would put it in his cell to remind him. And he found another inmate. He said, an older gentleman. He said he called him his first elder, who was also involved in, and they could actually talk and they could spend time together. So he found his people, so to speak, and all of what he found in that was the door opening to transformation, to being something beyond. He told me that he began to view his life of a life in chains, metaphorically, all along the way. And so his prayer, his vision, I would call it a prayer vision, was to move beyond the chains. And so he was still going to school, and he became a really great welder. He started working in the prison as a welder, and he did a lot of good, because when you live in a world of steel, there's a lot to weld, and so he was there. And eventually he connected to a group, again, an Afrocentric religious kind of group out in the world. He began to correspond with them. They would come visit him, and they began to go to bat with him around parole. And he got a parole hearing, and he was able to get out. He went to work for a while in a public agency where his criminal background wasn't held against him, kind of like social work. By this time he may have had a couple of degrees by this time. But it didn't, somehow there was something empty inside. And so he started his own nonprofit. That's not easy to do. Any of you have done nonprofits, and he started it, got it going, had a couple people kind of working for him, but his thing was, and he was in a neighborhood in Sacramento and was just working with young African-American men about moving beyond the chains and reclaiming who they really were, in his opinion. And so when I would see him in our institution, and I said he had them in the palm of his hand, that's what was it. They heard freedom. They heard personal expression. They heard we are more than the limited ideas that we are living by, not just that we hear and know, but we start to live by those limited ideas. That's what Jonathan Livingston Seagull is. The last line of this song, seek out your harbor of light. Let your song be heard. Rally each heart to the sight of your silver wings. Oh my God. That to me is so powerful. That is what touches my heart. That has been what's been important in my life. That is this teaching. And I would say it is the bedrock of all the great spiritual teachings. I believe this is the oldest wisdom there is. I've studied, because I'm such a spiritual culture wonk, I just read stuff and I watch documentaries and stuff. And the Native American traditions of the plains, they became what was called a horse culture once they got the horse, whenever it was. And so the first white people out there, European people who were out there and kind of experienced them before it all, went downhill because there were people who were interested who kind of went out into the West, and some of the writings of those people are actually housed in the Library of Congress. People who actually discovered tribes, kind of got in there, were trusted. They were just hanging out. They wanted to see what was going on. And one of the things I read in a piece in a book I had a long time ago that I no longer have, there was this guy who said he's looking around and he gets a sense that these are incredibly spiritual people, but he doesn't see a symbol. He doesn't see a cross. He doesn't see a Star of David. He doesn't, like what's going on here? So as best he could, he tried to ask, especially the spiritual leader, like, where's your symbol? And for a long time, there was this disconnect. There just wasn't something in the language. There wasn't the word. And finally, he kind of communicated it. Like, what's your spiritual symbols? And what he got in return was, everybody's got their own. And what he said was, look at the ponies. A pony belongs to an individual who hunts on it, goes to war on it, whatever. And you see how we decorate them. And we've all seen pictures of this, the decorated horses. And they're all different. And he said, the person whose pony that is, that's their symbol. That's their connection to higher power. That's their connection to what their calling is, what they bring forward into this world. And then the writer of this made the discovery, he started looking at the individuals, and they matched the horse because they decorated themselves. And it was their connection to spirit. That's why Richard Bach, and he's still around, by the way. I saw this interview with him fairly recently. No matter how old he gets, he still touches especially young people who say, what's my way? What's my way? And Richard Bach says, it's your relationship to freedom. It's your relationship to expansive consciousness. There's a line in Jonathan Livingston Seagull where he says, why would we have been given the gift of flight if we are just using it to go out to the garbage dump and fight over scraps and then come back? There's got to be something more. Doesn't that speak to all of us? The expansive expression, breaking loose in us. Ernest Holmes says, evolution is essentially the outpush of life into self-expression. We ought to daily enter into an expanded realm of life and living. For the will of life has only to be life. Everything then should trend towards expansion in consciousness within our divine plan. A seagull, young people who are trying to find their own way, a man who worked his way out of the chains of bondage and became an elder. And I'm saying that purposely because I remember that day I talked to him, and when we were done, I said, "What do you call yourself?" Because we have, preachers, ministers, counselors. He said, "I'm an elder." And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "To show the way, to break the chains, to bring forward the wisdom." He said, "I can't change anybody, but I can walk the path with them." And so this is the power of inhabiting an expansion-driven spiritual practice and way forward, to move beyond whatever is holding us down from moment to moment to moment. Now, I want to leave you today with an image of something, because I think sometimes in our movement it's almost like about young adults who are running around and moving around and changing careers and just doing whatever they can do with the resources. And as we get older, we think, well, where's our part in this? And so I want to share this story with you very briefly and in a very generic way. I was reading in a book a while back. It was a book of more like Eastern traditions. And there was this idea of, and so this story is a little bit on the metaphorical side. So imagine sitting with a loved one, and let's say it's in a hospice center. And we all know what hospice is about. It means, this person is about ready to go on the next stage of their journey. And that situation can be challenging, it can be difficult, it can be overbearing. As a minister, I've spent a lot of time in hospice, and I've spent a lot of time around people, which has been actually one of the greatest gifts I've ever gotten, was to be in that. And so it's amazing. And so imagine for a moment so the loved one is there, and they see what's going on. It's like, I want to be the very best for my loved one who's going through this difficult time. And I'm finding it overbearing, and the chains start to come on. The chains start to come on. It's like, what do I do? And so suddenly there appears some great Eastern teacher, some great old elder who comes in the robes and the finery. And the person says, "What should I do?" And the elder says, "Take yourself beyond this small place into a larger expression, and take your loved one with you." What does that mean? Speak the language of expansion. Speak the language of largeness, freedom, unbound, unchained, whatever that is. I worked with a gentleman in hospice who had been a big Harley person. He was about my age, way into Harleys, did the whole, Sturgis and all that stuff. And he was really struggling with hospice. And he was telling me one day he said, back home, I got a whole pile of these old black T-shirts all beat up there. All these runs I'd go on, all these Harley Davidson T-shirts. I used to live in those things. I rode in those things. And so I asked, I suddenly got this, and he was, he's struggling like, I'm dying, and this is the end, and all this stuff. And so I was trying to get him to grab a hold of the idea that the journey goes on, that he's eternal. So I got this idea, and I asked one of the nurses, I said, does he have to wear what he's wearing right now here? She said, no, as long as whatever he's wearing is clean, that's okay. So I said, have your mom go to your house and bring all those T-shirts down here. So he started wearing the T-shirts in hospice. And our conversation started to be, where's the next ride taking you? And it changed the whole thing. It wasn't me that changed it. It was him who had to get back on the Harley in order to change that. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is, because I've really gone over time, I apologize, is the idea that we are a prayer-centric philosophy. And I want to read this to you. Being a prayer-centric teaching is to teach this, and this is what we teach. Our prayer is a statement into the reality of self-expression through a stated expansion. Our form of prayer requires us to state an expansion from where we are. And the universe responds to that. All right. Thank you very much. Namaste. And so I am now going to ask Alan if he wants to give us his last tune.